Good evening, everyone. If you'd like to follow along tonight, we'll be in Psalms 37, and we'll be picking back up around verse 8. Psalm 37, around verse 8. Actually, I take that back, verse 7. Last week we started this psalm, and one of the very first things that we read in this psalm was David telling us not to be upset because of evildoers and not to be envious of wrongdoers. And he continues on through the psalm, giving us reasons why that's good advice, and also giving us other proverbial wisdom as he goes. And so we pick back up in verse 7 here. And David says, "Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not get upset because of the one who is successful in his way, because of the person who carries out wicked schemes." So verse 7 really is going back to what he led with in the beginning of the psalm, that this idea that we shouldn't be getting upset over the wicked person who's successful, right? Don't get upset because of the one who is successful, and notice, in his way, meaning mankind's way, because of the person who carries out wicked schemes. And we talked about this a little bit. You know, we've all felt that to some degree or another, where you look at someone who is clearly living an ungodly life, yet they seem to be enjoying much success or wealth or prosperity from that. And we're being told here that, don't let that upset you. Don't let that get in your way. And we see here in verse 8, he says, "Cease from anger and abandon wrath. Don't get upset." And so he keeps driving this point home about not getting upset. He says, it leads only to evil doing. It leads only to evil doing. So when I read this verse, there are several verses in the Bible that could come to mind. I guess that's a little small. But what I have up there on the board is Ephesians 4, verses 26 to 27, where it says, "Be angry and yet do not sin," right? So this message that we're seeing here in the Old Testament about not letting anger get the better of you, this is a message that's echoed in the New Testament as well. This idea of being in control of our anger, not letting that get away from us, right? Another verse that came to my mind was James chapter 1 and verse 20. It says, "For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God." Right? So we can see here there's multiple times where this is emphasized to us. Anger is going to get in the way. It's going to create an opportunity for sin to enter our lives. It's going to get in our way and trip us up. And so David is simply warning of that, right? Don't get upset. It's just going to get in your way. And then he goes on here and he expands a little bit about this. He tells us about the fate of the evildoers, right? Don't get upset about those who are doing evil, because this is what awaits them. And so now he talks about their fate. He says in verse 9, he says, "For evildoers will be eliminated, but those who wait for the Lord, they will inherit the land. Yet a little while, and the wicked person will be no more. And you will look carefully for his place, and he will not be there. But the humble will inherit the land and will delight themselves in abundant prosperity." So David compares the fates of those who are doing wicked and those who are following righteous. And so what are those two fates as David lays it out? What's the fate of the wicked? Destruction. Yeah, he says quite simply, they'll be eliminated, right? Now that might not mean in this lifetime, right? It might be something that comes later, but it's the ultimate fate here is that they will not have eternal life. If you take a step back and you think about your life here on earth, and your life to come after death, this life is just a drop in the bucket. It's just a small portion. And so if you spend that small portion living in sin and enjoying it as much as you want, and then the rest of it is spent in condemnation, was it really worth it, right? He's trying to put that into perspective. And as a contrast, he talks about a righteous person. So those who are humble, or your translation might say meek, there in verse 11, what's the fate of them? Peace. They'll inherit the land, right? In verse 11, that gets quoted later in the New Testament, that the meek will inherit the earth. Does anybody remember where? In the Beatitudes, yeah. Matthew chapter 5 is when Jesus is speaking, and he says, the meek will inherit the earth, right? So he is quoting from this psalm, which is really a promise that God is making, right? If Jesus is telling us that later, that's God's word, right? God's word in the flesh. And so this is a promise. We know this to be true, that the humble or the meek will inherit the land. And it says, and they will delight themselves in abundant prosperity. So when David says this, when Jesus later says this, what does it mean to inherit the land? Is he talking about the land around Israel, perhaps, right? In David's time? Is that what he's referring to? What do you think?
They really already had the land, right? So
right.
It kind of seems like he's talking about more maybe of a spiritual land, the God's kingdom.
Yeah. I think this verse and verses like this can sometimes lead to confusion among Christians. Right? Things like this is where ideas spring forward about, well, maybe this means that all wicked people one day on the earth will be dead, and then Christians will have free reign over the earth for a set period of time, and it'll just be us. And, odd ideas pop up from that when you take verses out of context. But here, when you look at what he's saying about the evildoers and how they're going to be eliminated, their ultimate fate, right? Their ultimate fate is to be eliminated. Then we can also understand that he's contrasting that to the righteous and their ultimate fate. So he's really talking about the afterlife here. It's either eternal life or eternal death, right? And this is what he's talking about. Any other thoughts, questions, or comments on that part before we move on? Okay. The only other thought I had there is when he says that they will delight themselves in abundant prosperity. When you look in Revelation and you look at some of the imagery that's used to describe heaven, right, and how it's adorned, with roads that are like gold and all the precious gems that cover the foundations, and certainly to live in a land like that would be abundant prosperity, right? So it's nice to see, again, those things carried through the entire scriptures. But then dropping down to verse 12, David says, the wicked plots against the righteous and gnashes at him with his teeth. The Lord laughs at him, speaking of the wicked. The Lord laughs at him, for he sees that his day is coming. So we see that the wicked plot against the righteous. Not only might the wicked be enjoying this success here on earth, but they're also plotting against the righteous. And what does God think of that? What's his response here?
They will have a payday in judgment.
They will have a payday in judgment, yeah, but in verse 13, what's it say the Lord does? He laughs, right? Why does he laugh?
He knows what's coming.
He knows what's coming, right?
Well, it's kind of amusing. It would be kind of amusing because he's watching all this.
Mm-hmm.
And he knows what's going to take place. So it's like...
Yeah. Just the idea that an earthly person could succeed against God is utterly ridiculous, right? It's like if one of us was to go into a boxing match with a professional boxer, we're not going to last very long, right? That's ridiculous. You're just so outmatched. And this is magnitudes of difference against that, right? This isn't even facing an entire army by yourself. This is going against the will of God. It's laughable, right? Judy?
That just reminded me of what just happened in Israel. It's like the gnashing of the teeth, and that's what popped in my mind.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. And let's see, another verse that came into mind, again, going with the idea of, who can go against God? Romans 8 and verse 31, if God is for us, who is against us? Right? Again, this idea that there is no one who can combat God. And so we see that although the wicked do gnash their teeth at the righteous, God is on their side, right? God is their refuge. And so those schemes are laughable in the face of God's might. He goes on in verse 14, he says, the wicked have drawn the sword and bent their bow to take down the afflicted and the needy, to kill off those who are upright in conduct. Their sword will enter their own heart, and their bows will be broken. Better is the little of the righteous than the abundance of many wicked. So David is continuing this thought here and talking about how the wicked gnash their teeth at the righteous. And he says they've drawn their sword and their bow against them. But how's that turn out? Again, not well, right? Doesn't work well. It says that their sword will enter their own heart and their bows will be broken. And this isn't just symbolic, right? This is quite literal in many cases. Think of Saul. Saul drew his sword against David, right? Who was chosen by God. And how did Saul die? He fell on his own sword, right? Quite literally, he died by his own sword. And there are many other times where the wicked die by their own schemes, right? You might think back to Mordecai and I think it's pronounced Haman, right? The guy that he was up against. So many times the wicked are destroyed by their own schemes. You can even think of Satan, right? The entire idea of getting Jesus to be killed, right? That seems like a victory. And yet, that was God's plan all along, because by Jesus' death, the whole world can be saved. And so by the very trap that they think that they're setting, they're destroyed. So we see that all throughout the Bible. And David kind of explains what he's getting at here. Yes, the wicked will be defeated, but again, the whole idea of what he's been saying is you shouldn't be upset about whatever prosperity they're enjoying. You shouldn't be envious of them, because their ultimate fate is not good. Whatever the prosperity they enjoy now is, it's limited. It's going to end. And so now he's trying to give you some advice and comfort you. In verse 16, he says, better is the little of the righteous than the abundance of many wicked. It's better to have a little bit and be content with that than to have the riches of so many wicked. Kim?
It's interesting that the wicked are preying on both the poor and needy and the righteous.
Yeah.
I mean, they're already in, the poor and the needy are already in a bad way.
Yeah.
But the righteous often stand out.
Yeah.
Because they are choosing to live godly. And they're a target.
Yeah.
They become a target, and the wicked go after them.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it makes much sense, right? Like, if you're this wealthy person, why would you need to go after the poor and the needy, right? What do they have that's worth it, right? It seems like, very little gain for all of your effort, right? Yeah, exactly. And so he's talking about this idea of essentially being content with the physical things in this life that you do have, rather than having an abundance of things, right? Now, does this mean that only the wicked can have abundance in this life? Of course not, right? I mean, David was a wealthy man. He was a king. Abraham was a wealthy man, right? Job was a wealthy man. It's not owning the wealth that is the problem, right? It's what effect it has on you and how you use it, right? Jim, did you have your hand up?
Man allows the wealth to control him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're not thinking about really who God is,
Mm-hmm.
far beyond what we can comprehend.
Yeah.
And the blessings are there. All we've got to do is do it the right way.
Right. Rick?
Yeah. Wealth creates a lot of temptation that we don't normally have.
Yeah.
If you think about it, suddenly, like, look at a lot of young people who are like in sports and they
Mhm.
become millionaires overnight, and that they have all this temptation, and a lot of times that gets them into trouble. And it's
Yeah.
kind of understandable. We don't always know how to handle that much wealth, that
Right.
much power, whatever it is.
Yeah. I mean, that draws the mind to the prodigal son, right? Now, he was already kind of going down a bad path at first, but, he had a bunch of wealth by having his inheritance early. And so that led to its own set of temptations. Now, all this wealth at that young age, and we can see, how that made his life go askew, right? So that's a great example. Any other thoughts?
Yes, you cannot outgive God. I have heard that for years,
Mm-hmm.
and it's essentially, it's true.
Yeah.
You cannot outgive God with service or anything else.
Yeah. Shirley, I think you had your hand up next.
Yes, I'm sitting here thinking about some people that have wealth,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of wealth. They are truly not happy.
Mm-hmm.
And because they're always wanting more and more. And it's almost like they're envious of someone they see that is at peace. They're really not at peace.
Yeah.
And it's I don't, and there are some people that are wealthy and they are Christians.
Yeah.
And if you didn't have those that had money, you wouldn't have people that would establish businesses, own them, and employ a lot of people. You almost have to have, to balance it out, you almost have to have the wealthy and the poor. And there will always be poor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think Kim and then Cookie.
I was thinking about what you said, the poor and the needy, what are the wicked going to gain from them?
Yeah.
And the only thing I could think of was to have power and control over them.
Yeah. At that point, it's more about power and control, right? Yeah. Cookie, I think you're next.
Yeah. These people that win these lotteries,
Mm-hmm.
millions and billions of dollars. I said to my dad one day, I said, what are they going to do with all that money? He says, I'll tell you, they're going to burn with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a very good answer.
Eldred?
I heard a sermon one time. I don't remember now where it was at or exactly how it went, but I know it was the 5 wealthiest people in the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
And it was telling about some of their lives. But evidently, this guy either knowed of them or had read about them or what, but he acted like he knowed them. Whether he did or not, I don't know. Anyhow, the 5 richest people in the whole world. I mean, I had no idea how much riches they had.
Yeah.
But the thing of it was, when they died, they almost died alone.
Yeah.
Fine.
Did I miss anyone? A lot of hands went up all at the same time, so I just want to make sure that I didn't miss anyone on that one. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, our society is one where money is highly lauded, right? America cares a lot about money. It's how it is. And so it's something that we can all understand to some level what effect money can have on people. And in a very similar way, the society that was in power at the time when Jesus was on earth was also one very similar to ours, right? Rome was very much that way. And so money was a big problem. And money puts people's priorities out of order. And so you can see that reflected in Jesus' teachings. Go back sometime when you have the time, at least just through the first 4 Gospels there, and look at the different times that Jesus mentions a parable or a lesson that relates to wealth or money or materials. It's a lot. There's a lot of times when Jesus is explaining to people how they should have a right relationship with earthly riches, right? And what priority they should be. You know, he talks about taxes, right? And giving to Caesar what is Caesar's. He talks to the young man about selling off his wealth and following after him. There's so many different examples. And that is probably because of how much money can sidetrack someone, right? So, and again, we see this is all the way back in David's time, all the way to now. It's a problem that's always existed. So it's very good advice to have. It's certainly one that we can all fall prey to at one time or another. So this psalm serves as a lot of good daily advice in our lives. Okay. So I think now we're on to verse 17. So as David continues here, he says, "For the arms of the wicked will be broken, but the Lord sustains the righteous. The Lord knows the days of the blameless, and their inheritance will be forever. They will not be ashamed in the time of evil, and in the days of famine they will have plenty." Okay, so here David's elaborating. He's talking that God sustains the righteous and will break the arms of the wicked, right? He says God watches over the righteous through evil times, through famine, and the wicked will vanish like smoke. So think about the lesson that David's trying to tell here. Again, he started at the beginning and he's telling you not to be envious of the wicked who might be prosperous, right? To be content. He says God will sustain you. Times of evil, you know, you might think of that as maybe war or civil unrest or things like that. Times of famine, you might care a whole lot more about money because you're worried about your survival or perhaps the well-being of your family, right? In evil times, you're worried about your stability. You want to be able to live in peace. And money seems like an obvious tool to help you get there, right? And so in these stressful times, it makes money seem like the way to go, right? To chase after that, to try and get that peace, right? And those are times when maybe you would be more envious of those who are wicked or the ways that they're obtaining wealth. But he's trying to reassure and say, in those times, you don't need to worry because God will sustain you, right? So he's stressing this. And as he is trying to impart this wisdom for your daily life, he's also offering words of comfort here, reminding you God will take care of you. You don't have to let those hard times shift your priorities to the wrong place. Don't let that worry push you to the wrong place, right? Let's see here. Verse 21. He says, "The wicked borrows and does not pay back, but the righteous is gracious and gives. For those blessed by him will inherit the land, but those cursed by him will be eliminated." So verse 22 is really just reiterating what we've heard so far. But again, notice in verse 21, the wicked borrows and does not pay back, but the righteous is gracious and gives. So God would have us to be generous to one another, right? To care for one another, to be generous givers. We have a commandment to lay by and store here. That's another way that we should give. But again, if you are going through a hard time or famine or something like that, you might be tempted to not want to give, to not be generous. If you see someone in need, you think, well, maybe I could give them some money, but what happens if I need that money soon? I won't have anything to fall back on. I need to have that for myself. I need to watch out for me. And again, David's trying to make sure that your priorities don't get out of order. Go ahead and do what God wants you to do, right? Be gracious and give, because God sustains you through those hard times. So because you don't need to worry about that, you can go ahead and follow what God would have you to do. So this whole thing is really about trusting in God rather than getting sidetracked by wealth that you can see the wicked having. So just, again, some daily things that are some everyday life kind of things. Do pay back when you borrow, right? Because the wicked don't do that. And so by contrast, that's something we should do. Rick?
Yeah, and the way that's worded in verse 21, it kind of reminds me of where we're told to lend, expecting nothing in return.
Yeah.
Which is essentially giving.
Yeah.
That's really what he's talking about. So.
Yeah. I mean, if someone pays you back, great, right?
Yeah.
But if not, don't be upset about that. Be gracious, right? Be gracious and give. And then on the flip side of that, don't borrow and then not pay it back. If you do need to borrow, pay it back, right? Don't be selfish and hold the money to yourself and not give, right? So just some basic daily, everyday life kind of advice in terms of how to handle money. Be generous because God is being generous. It says that he will give the righteous the land to inherit, right? So God is being generous to you. And of course, we want to copy God's example in every way that we can. We want to be as like him as it's possible for humans to be, right? And so if God is generous, then we too want to be generous and live our lives in that fashion. So then he says in verse 23, he says, the steps of a man are established by the Lord, and he delights in his way. When he falls, he will not be hurled down because the Lord is the one who holds his hand. So the steps of a man are established by the Lord, and he delights in his way. What do you think David is saying there? What does that mean? Rick?
Now mine reads slightly differently, and it might be helpful. The
Yeah.
steps of a good man are
Okay.
ordered by the Lord, and he delights in his way, meaning this good man is being ordered. He's following the Lord's commandments. He's following the Lord's word, and that's why God delights in his way, because he's being faithful and following his word.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great interpretation of it, right? I think God has obviously laid out this path that he would have the righteous to follow. There's a lifestyle and a pattern in which we should follow, and Jesus expounds upon that for us. He's an example for us. As we walk that path, it delights God to see that, right? God has laid this path out, and this is a path that's pleasing to him. And so when we walk that, it delights him, right? Also, God knows you, knows who you are even before you're born, right? And he sets a path for you. Now, you can follow that path or not, but when you follow after what God would have you to do, again, it's delighting to him. So I'm pretty sure that that is what he's saying. And then, of course, when you fall, you won't be hurled down because God is there holding your hand, right? Now, when it says you fall, what is it talking about? What do you think? Fall from grace? Okay. Any other thoughts?
We sin or we have a setback of some kind, maybe not necessarily sin, but just a setback in that plan.
Yeah, I could see that being both, right? That could be just an everyday kind of setback in life, right? You think of Joseph being thrown in prison, right? That's a setback in life, but he didn't need to worry about it, right? So that's a possibility. It might not have anything to do with sin. Or it could be when you sin, when you fall down, when you trip up. You're not going to be hurled down because you're trying to walk that righteous path. God will be there to hold your hand, right? And that would be the idea of extending grace through Jesus to you. So either way, I think both have application there as well. It's just the idea that, again, God is the refuge for those who are righteous. And I think we're just out of time tonight. And we have several verses left to go in this psalm. So we'll stop there for tonight. And Lord willing, next Wednesday, we'll go ahead and finish Psalm 37. All right. Thank you, everyone.
I thought for just a few minutes we could look at Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. And this is these two verses give us a very specific message. Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few that find it. Now this is Jesus speaking. He's heading towards the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And I just want to take a look at this. It says, enter by the narrow gate. And why, narrow gate, and let's see, because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way. So the gate is narrow and there are few who find it. The reason there are few who find it is because there are few who will accept Jesus. He is that gate. He is that door, right? There's several verses where he says he is the gate, he is the door, he is the way. And so people are struggling to find Jesus in this world we have today. But we want to remember that he is the door, he is the gate, and he is the way for us. We also want to remember that narrow way is narrow, difficult, tight. It's hard to bring through all that old baggage that we have with us, right? Our old life, our old sins. Because it's narrow, it's compressed, it's difficult. We're not supposed to be dragging all that stuff with us, to be honest, but you get the idea. It's a narrow, difficult path following the Lord. It's not easy. And that's why, and it's hard to find, and then it's hard to follow that path. It's hard to go through that path. Whereas opposed to the other path, which is broad and wide, is very easy. It's very easy. It's just like, if you think about it in a way, it's just like life. Here, to find life is difficult, right? To find destruction is easy. And that's similar to just our everyday lives. It's harder to live life than it is just to die. You can just sit around and wait to die. You don't have to do anything, do you? And that's kind of a comparison there, too, of that. But to live a life, a good life, to follow Jesus is going to be difficult. It's going to be hard. But the reward is going to be so worth it. To go through that narrow path, even though that's difficult and it's tight, and we may be uncomfortable at times, and we may have to leave a lot of things behind that we can't drag through there because it's narrow, it's compressed, it's restricted. But it's supposed to be. And it's supposed to help us as we go through that narrow path to learn to let go of those things, to let those things go and leave them behind because we don't need them. We're following the one we need, and that's the Lord. That's Jesus. That's who we need, and that's who we're following. We don't want to be distracted while we're on that path and fall off the other way. We want to stay in this path, even though it is hard and there'll be temptations at times to give up. We don't want to do that. The reward is so much worth it. The reward to be in heaven, to see Jesus, to see God, all of that will be so much worth all the difficulties we have here, whatever we go through here. That path is hard, it's difficult, it's not easy, I know, but the reward is well worth it. It will be beyond what we can imagine. That's why I don't even have the words for it. But I just want to remind us of that. I know at times life is difficult and we may struggle and have a lot of hard times or have hard times from off and on. But I just wanted to remind us that even though it is difficult and it's hard, we're on the right path. We're following. If we're following Jesus, we're following the right one. And we're on the right way. Sometimes that's why it's difficult too, because we are on the right way. If you were going the wrong way, you'd just have it made, right? It'd just be easy. That's the broad path. You just slide on down. No problem. So I just wanted to remind us of that. The reward is so worth it. To be in heaven, to see Jesus, to see God. That will all be well worth it. So if anyone here this evening were to have any need to find that narrow road or to recommit if you've strayed or anything of that nature, or if there's anything that we could help you with, please come forward as we stand and sing.